Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a better understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, author, editor, lecturer, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. And for those of you who don't actually traffic in rare books, you might be a little confused about foxed page. Foxing is simply those little brownish spots, discoloration that you see on the pages of very old, beloved books. Today, we are diving into Cormac McCarthy. So I have been wanting to record something about McCarthy since he died. I think it was in June of this year, maybe July, I think June. And I was waiting until I kind of had it in me to tackle The Passenger and Stella Maris. I did that this week. I tackled both of them. In fact, I listened to Stella Maris, which was really interesting. I have to say that these books, they came out last year, I think in October and November. There was a little bit of controversy. Mostly people thought they were amazing, but there was, the occasional detractor. And I have to say that I found them so incredibly engaging. I just found myself absolutely subsumed into this literature. I did find myself reading a little bit quickly, kind of like I did with Anna Burns with Milkman, because it's pretty intense. And so I found myself kind of reading a little breathlessly and wanting to kind of move through, in part because what I was reading was difficult, also because it was just so incredibly beautiful. This doesn't happen to me very often, but I would find myself saying things like, okay, at the end of this chapter, I'm gonna get up and feed the dogs, or whatever the thing was that I needed to do. And I just kept reading and reading and reading, and frankly, really impressed and really heartened in a weird way. I mean, they're very dark works, and yet it just really spoke to something inside of me. So what I'm hoping to do today is the following. We are going to do a little conversation about why I think you should read this book and why I am talking about Cormac McCarthy's work in general. We'll do a quick biography. Then we're going to talk a little more broadly about the book itself. We're going to talk about the structure of both The Passenger and Stella Maris. Then we're going to talk about the absolute gorgeous beauty of the prose. And I'm going to sort of break down the reasons why I think the prose is so incredibly great. We're going to talk about his influences, which are many and well documented. And we're going to talk about some certain aspects of this work in particular that I think make it particularly engaging. We're going to talk a little bit about misogyny in the work of Cormac McCarthy, not too broadly, because I just don't feel prepared to really dive into the whole oeuvre. But we are going to talk about a little shift that I'm sensing here in The Passenger and Stella Maris, where finally we have a female character who is really front and center and really very much, the heart of the book in some ways. And then finally, we're going to do a little bit of a parlor trick, where one of the things that has been critiqued about these novels is the digressive nature of The Passenger. And we'll get to what I mean by that. But I would argue that literally every sentence, every paragraph, every scene that feels like a digression from the, sort of main thrust of the book is in fact reinforcing that main thrust. So I think people who are just wait, what's up with all these digressions they're just not focused enough. And allow me to explain exactly what I mean by that, and also maybe to hone your focus before you are diving into the book. So why do I think you should read Cormac McCarthy? Why was I looking forward to it so much? Partially, again, because he died. He's largely recognized as sort of one of the greatest American novelists. There's also talk about him potentially receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's just one of these enormous figures in American letters, and really has a lot to say about what it is not only to be American, but what it is to be human. So I would suggest that you read it for that alone. I mean, the themes he tackles are enormous, and he does it with such skill and with such originality that it's just astonishing. And given the reception of this last work and the way that it has sort of, garnered a lot of interest in early McCarthy. So there's early McCarthy, and then there's later McCarthy, and sort of bridged by All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, and Cities of the Plain, which is the trilogy that really sort of earned him a spotlight. So in fact, I'll just run through this right now. But we have, in the very beginning, he wrote a book called The Orchard Keeper, and a book early on, there was The Orchard Keeper, Child of God, Suttree. Those were all these really ornate, sort of Baroque, fanciful books. I actually have not read any of them, which I'm really excited to go back and look at the early Cormac McCarthy. Then he wrote Blood Meridian, which is known as sort of his magnum opus. And that is a book that I read and that I loved. It's known for being very challenging and difficult, and it is, certainly, but it's really, really worth, the investment of time and energy. After Blood Meridian, and all of his early work was really received well by the critics, and he had sort of this cult following, but never really a big, commercial following. He came out with the Border Trilogy, which is All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, and Cities of the Plain. One of the critics I was reading about recently said that Cormac McCarthy has finally written a book that will offend no one, which is not true, because I think a lot of women were offended. There's been sort of a simmering of misogyny throughout all of his career, largely because of the absence of women in his work, which I just don't know that that's fair. I mean, if there aren't women in the book, that's just a fact. I mean, we're going to get to this. We'll get to the misogyny later. But the Border Trilogy, beginning with All the Pretty Horses, had huge commercial success and sort of put him on the map with a much wider readership. And then he went on to write No Country for Old Men and The Road at the beginning of the 21st century. I think they come out in 2005 and 2006. And for The Road, he wins the Pulitzer Prize and the James Tate Memorial Prize. And Old Country for Old Men, No Country for Old Men, was very successful, largely because the film was so good and because it was, it had lots and lots of Academy Award, winnings. What do you call that? It won Academy Awards, one of them including Best Picture. And it's a movie that's incredible, but it also really brought the book to the fore. And a lot of people read those two books, which is so interesting to me because the Border Trilogy with John Grady Cole, and it's kind of a Western novel, and there's a romance in it, and it had very broad appeal. The Road is a post-apocalyptic story about a father and a son. It's very brief. It's very intense. It is a book that I read once and was so incredibly moved and really wanted to read it again. And I've honestly just not been able to do it. I mean, it just was so moving and so well done and so dense and so beautiful. And I recommended it to a million people. And then I just couldn't ever quite get myself back to a place where I was ready to dig in again. Then he wrote No Country for Old Men, which is just incredibly violent and really explores the idea of evil. And that was also very successful. So those were two very dark books that really he did very well with. Then we wait 16 years, and finally we have, in 2022, the arrival of The Passenger, that's followed 1 month later by Stella Maris. So we're going to get to the sort of the context of those, but I've just laid out all of the work, and here's why I think you should be reading Cormac McCarthy. One is that there's this incredible literary prowess. So this is a man who he didn't study a ton of literature. He for a while was, I think, at the University of Tennessee. He was born in Rhode Island and then was raised and grew up for the most part in Knoxville, Tennessee. Went to the University of Tennessee for a little while, dropped out of college to go to the Air Force. But in college had been encouraged to start writing, which he started to do. And then I don't know that he ever graduated from college. It doesn't really matter. So that's a good segue into the fact that, yes, the work is very original in lots of ways, but it also has these enormous debts to huge writers, to Shakespeare, to Melville, to Conrad, to Faulkner in a huge, huge way. So this is somebody who is writing. It's almost well, James would call him a ventriloquist, essentially that he is able to bring all of these voices to bear when he is writing his own fiction. In fact, he was criticized early on because his writing was so Faulknerian that one critic said that his own considerable genius was not shining all the way through. But I personally love it because you have this amalgam of these voices, Faulkner and also Hemingway, all these different important thinkers. He went to Catholic school, he's Irish Catholic, and was really affected by the King James Bible. So you have all of these different literary, it's like a literary smoothie is really maybe one way to think about it. But it's so incredible because it is all of these voices sort of synthesized, all of the kind of best of those incredible writers synthesized into this unique voice that is unmistakable and really just, it's just absolutely beautiful prose. He also, there is an importance of the themes. He said himself that he really only likes the work of people who are really thinking about the very, very big questions, literally questions of life and death. So he's tackling these enormous themes, these enormous questions about good and evil, about what it means to be human, about what consciousness is. I mean, these huge, huge, big questions, but what's very important is he's doing it all in a milieu and kind of like an everyman situation where you are really, it's very approachable in terms of story. So this is a John Grady Cole in All the Pretty Horses, or the father figure in The Road. These are people who are very approachable. He has these protagonists who just have this incredible warmth to them, and they tend to be quiet, which is interesting because you feel like you know them so well, and yet they are, generally speaking, men of very few words. But their actions speak volumes, and also the details are so well done, and the scenes are so well constructed, and the dialogue is so incredibly hardworking that you have this sense of, you love these people, you love these characters who populate the fiction, who are vulnerable and who are approachable. And in No Country for Old Men, and actually in The Passenger, these are men who are kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time in some ways. The Passenger is more complicated than that, but we're going to get to it. But these people, these humans who get sort of caught up in these schemes, government and mob and otherwise, and you really, really have enormous sympathy for them, and you really love these characters, not just the main ones, but like lots of them. Then you also abhor some of these characters because they're so truly awful. But so you have this incredible balance of real sympathy, which I think leads to incredible engagement with the work. So that is why I think that you should read this book. We're going to move on to the biography. I've given you snippets here and there, but we're just going to lay it out here. Cormac McCarthy was born in 1933 in Providence, Rhode Island. He was third of 6 children in an Irish Catholic family. And the Irish Catholicism is really important and really interesting to me. So the family then moved to Knoxville, Tennessee. His father was a lawyer in the Tennessee Valley administration during, the FDR years, all those, work grant kind of years of good democracy. And so they were relatively comfortable. He says that they were known as being rich just because everyone else was living in like a one-room shack. This is during, during the 30s, during the Depression. He had 3 wives, and he has 2 boys, and one from they're very far apart in age. One from, I believe, his second marriage. His first marriage only lasted for a year. I read this stuff about his life with his wives. So he's incredibly intense and incredibly serious about his writing. So there was lots of like sacrificing everything and living in these really almost squalid conditions in order to not have to work and in order to devote himself entirely to his job. One of the things in The Passenger is that as Bobby Western is getting sort of further and further away from society, as he is trying to sort of, take himself out of danger because he needs to be inconspicuous, he ends up living in a shack on a beach, and then he ends up living in a windmill. And I kept thinking, like, Cormac McCarthy has a lot of experience with this kind of like living in these shitty places. I mean, maybe he doesn't think they're shitty, he probably thinks they're great, but like no plumbing and no bathroom and no heat and all of that kind of stuff. I think it would be rough if you were someone who was not fully on board with that, to then have to sort of subject yourself to it. So my sense is that he probably was a really hard dude to be married to. I don't know though, but I mean, 3 divorces, that tells us something. He wrote 12 novels, 12 novels, 2 plays, 5 screenplays, and 3 short stories. And there's quite a bit of papers that I think are at UT Austin. I think I'm wrong about that. It might be Yale. I can't remember. But there's a lot of work. There is talk that a movie version of Blood Meridian is maybe in production by the same people who did No Country for Old Men. So there's a lot of sort of excitement about what that might look like. In Wikipedia, it says he is known for his graphic depiction of violence and his sparse use of punctuation and attribution. So a lot is made of his punctuation, and attribution is simply like when you say he said and the sort of glosses that we have talked about in the Fox page in the past. So he doesn't use quotation marks and he doesn't use attribution, which is their glosses that'll tell you like he said as he was walking out the door, that sort of thing. But there's much more to his prose. I mean, if it were just punctuation and a lack of attribution, there are, a handful of very well-known other authors who do that same thing. It also says in Wikipedia, though, that he is widely regarded as one of the great American novelists, which is, I think, undisputable. I mean, he's just really just extraordinary, frankly, in terms of prose styling, in terms of theme, in terms of the scope of his novel, the breadth of his oeuvre. It's incredible. In 1985, Blood Meridian, that was published, and that is known as his sort of magnum opus, and some people consider it the great American novel, which that's a little dubious. I think there are a lot of great American novels. It's hard not to look at Gatsby as one, for example, or The Sound and the Fury is very sort of regionalist, but there's a lot of, there are a bunch of novels that we could point to, and certainly Blood Meridian is also somewhat regionalist. All the Pretty Horses in 1992 won the National Book Award, also the National Book Critics Circle Award, and No Country for Old Men in 2005 was made into the movie and won an Academy Award. So, that's kind of a nice accolade for McCarthy. And then 2006 saw the publication of The Road, and it was named the Pulitzer Prize winner and the James Tate Memorial Prize winner in 2007. And then again, we had 16 years to wait before we saw The Passenger and Stella Maris. Those books were rumored, though, to have been started as early as 1980. There's a lot of kind of rumor about the origins of The Passenger and Stella Maris both. And when we talk about structure, we can talk about some of the theories about how the two relate to one another. So brief bio, digression about this Irishness of McCarthy. So, he comes from an Irish Catholic family, went to Irish Catholic schools, was one of 6 children. Not Irish Catholic schools, went to like American Catholic schools, but was really sort of, I think, steeped in some of this kind of what I like to think of as some of the angst and some of the foreboding and some of the darkness that I'm frankly really drawn to in Irish literature. What is interesting to me, and stay tuned for an entire lecture about this on the Fox page at some point soon, is the sort of the Venn diagram of the South and of Ireland in terms of literature. There is a lot of area, a lot of surface area, a lot of area. That is sort of the intersection of those two Venn diagram circles. So both of them, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but if you think about Ireland and you think about the South, there is quite a bit, we have religious places in both situations. We have places that have sort of either been colonized in the case of Ireland or have tried to sort of secede. They're places that feel very, very different from, like they themselves feel very different from the country in which they are kind of, involved, or in the case of the South, the country in which they are very firmly, situated. In both of them, you have a legacy of a lot of violence. So with Ireland, with the sectarian wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, it's a very real and very recent sort of violence. And in the South, you have the violence of the Civil War. And in the South, you have the incredible weight of slavery and the complicated I mean, complicated is like maybe not the right word, but like you have this very like huge legacy that really, you know, is should burden the South in lots of ways. So I don't have a perfect analogy there for Irish, but these are places also, bodies of literature where a sense of place is incredibly important. So, you know, you think of Faulkner, you think of James Joyce, and both of those are modernist writers. They're people who were formally inventive. There's a lot of overlap between what's happening in Ireland in terms of literature and what's happening in the American South. So if you have someone like McCarthy who is Irish, you know, by sort of, you know, culture and by extraction and by religion, and you have him in the South, you've got like kind of a double whammy here. You got a lot of Catholic guilt, I would imagine. You've got a lot of Catholic teachings. You've got a lot of, you know, sort of the sort of framework of Catholicism, and you then also have and Ireland. You know, these are immigrants, presumably sometime in the not too distant past from Ireland. So you have this idea of then being in the South, where you know you have a whole other host of you know sort of reasons to be angstful. So I'm very interested in this mashup between Ireland and the South. Stay tuned because the Fox page will be diving a bit deeper. I want to stop there after the biography and talk a little bit about his influences. So James Wood, who is a British critic who is just like so smart, and I really, really love his work. He calls Cormac McCarthy colossally gifted. And again, this is someone whose literary tastes I really admire. He goes on to say that he writes with a histrionic rhetoric that brilliantly ventriloquizes the King James Bible, Shakespearean and Jacobean tragedy, Melville, Conrad, and Faulkner. I have to say, I didn't really know what Jacobean tragedy is. I mean, I guess that's the King James, you know, era. I can't even remember. I think maybe King James came right after the Elizabethan era. So I just was like, okay, British critic, he's just like a little flex for all of the Americans who are like, wait, what? We all got the Shakespearean thing. That was, you know, Elizabethan. We're talking latter half of the 16th century. So 1550 to like, I don't know, 1610, 1620 is kind of Shakespeare's moment. It's Elizabethan England. Then we have Jacobean. I think maybe Shakespearean and Jacobean simply mostly just means Shakespearean. I think it's funny because I was like, I got the rest of the references. The King James Bible, Shakespeare, Melville, Conrad, and Faulkner. I'm not a huge Melville fan, and I know a lot of people, you know, really, really see a lot of Melville in Cormac McCarthy, but I'm still not going to go back and read a lot of Melville. I just was like, all that blubber, you know, Moby Dick, just like a lot about knots and a lot about blubber. And I was just like, no, thank you. Conrad I loved, but I haven't read for a long time. I mean, both of those in Melville and Conrad, you have that kind of maniacal focus and this kind of idea of like degeneration and the idea of obsession as sort of taking over, which are very McCarthy-esque kind of concepts. Faulkner, I know and love. I also see a lot of James Joyce in McCarthy, which I think is a very fair thing. There's a lot of wordplay, a lot of very sort of clever stuff, a lot of humor. Also, very importantly, James Joyce did not ever use what he called scare quotes. I think that's actually falsely attributed to him. I don't think that James Joyce actually called them scare quotes, but everybody says that he did. James Joyce felt like having the quotation marks and then these glosses that were these attributions of who was speaking, he felt like it took the reader too far out of the work. So I think you have to be a very, very skilled writer in order to be able to write without quotation marks and to make sure that your reader is feeling, you know, well enough kind of tethered to what is going on and who is talking. In the case of James, he does what they do in Spain, which he uses an em dash at the beginning of a line that is spoken by someone. So you have an em dash and then you have a line of dialogue in James. In the case of McCarthy, he gets rid of the em dash and he just goes ahead and writes the dialogue. And I find it very, very effective. When the reader is confused, you can keep this in mind when you're reading McCarthy. As the reader, I mean, sometimes I would have to make like a little B for like, okay, this is Bobby talking, and then I have to be like, B, skip, B, skip, B, because I was getting a little confused. But most of the time when I was getting confused, it is because Faulkner, oh my gosh, I'm probably going to do that a lot. It's because McCarthy wants you on some level, like he doesn't really care if you're kind of melding these two voices together, because it's either, Bobby Western and his sister Alicia, or it's Bobby and his best friend Shadan. It could be these different people, or again, toward the end, he's having this very important sort of hallucinatory conversation with his best friend, who actually is dead. And when the voices kind of start melding together, you really have to ask yourself, meaning he has them set up as dialogue, but they start to kind of meld together. And you're reminded of the fact that this is something that our protagonist is imagining. So he uses this unusual dialogue sort of punctuation in very effective ways. And for me, that really has everything to do with James Joyce. It's important to note, too, that Faulkner's last editor was a guy named Albert Erskine, and Albert Erskine was at some point McCarthy's editor. Another note in terms of influences, so McCarthy himself has said that the good writers are Melville, Faulkner, Dostoevsky, and they are the good writers because they deal with issues of life and death. So, you have a sense, those are people who, Dostoevsky, again, you think of Crime and Punishment, you think of the brothers Karamazov, like this is all about loyalty. They're very male worlds. It's about violence. It's about, the nature of human beings and sort of the human condition, all of these very, very large questions. Obviously, Faulkner does a lot with that, and Melville too. Melville, a lot of big questions plus a lot of blubber and a lot of knots. He famously is just like this incredible, I want to say polymath, which now I don't even know if that's the right word. I think that means somebody who's like interested in a lot of different things. Apparently in high school, a teacher asked, what people's hobbies were. And he literally like had so many hobbies that people were like, whoa, what, dude, like chill. But because he's so interested in so many different things. And you do get a sense in his work, like if you look at, John Grady Cole as a Western guy, or you look at, even like the crazy psychopath in No Country for Old Men, or you look at all the skills of the father in the post-apocalyptic terrain of the road, or you look at all the physics and all of the math and all of the specialized information about race car driving and about deep sea salvage. Like this is a man who knows so much. So he's someone who's really, really very bright as far as his work shows, but also someone who has a huge breadth of interest and really seems to know a lot. Dwight Garner, who is, I feel like he's like a food critic for the New York Times, but he was the one who wrote McCarthy's obituary. And he talks about how he had written a number of different times as a critic. Maybe he's also a book critic, he must be. He had written different articles about McCarthy's work. And in, I believe it maybe even was The Passenger, he had, I think there's some criticism about how well and how accurately Cormac McCarthy is portraying like literally the restaurant scene in New Orleans. So McCarthy spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and literally Dwight Garner, who also has a lot of interest in food, realized that when Cormac McCarthy has two characters come in and order pasta, Dwight Garner's like, they would definitely not have clam pasta at that restaurant. Like that's just not, it's never been on their menu. It never would be on their menu. They don't really do clams in New Orleans. So he, I think, did write to McCarthy, and McCarthy, for all his intensity and for all of his, like, what seems to me as like being kind of a weird dude, I guess he also does have a sense of humor, and like wrote something about how he really needed to like put in a footnote or make a correction or whatever. But Dwight Garner says that in fact, McCarthy, because he is so knowledgeable and so authoritative on so many subjects, that he's also very sensitive to getting things right. So you do have a sense of him as being like a magnet and like a ventriloquist for all of these, not only the literary influences, but all of these different areas of specialty. I mean, the way he talks about deep sea salvaging, you're like, obviously he's done a lot of deep sea salvaging. which I do not think he has done. He also, you would think he's like an incredible race car driver. I mean, all of these different things. He's really, really very good, very chameleon-like, and has a lot of authority. And as a reader, you end up really trusting that authority, which is no mean feat. Before I go on to talk about the structure, I want to just briefly explain why I have this incredible painting sitting next to me here. So this was actually done by one of my cousins. I have two cousins who are incredible artists who support themselves by their, by their visual art, which is just, it's so incredible to me. And they're very, very skilled. This, to me, always feels like Alice in Wonderland. This, I have this sense, I mean, the red shoes are maybe like a little bit more, Wizard of Oz, but this idea of Alice, the blonde, the blue dress, this idea of Alice falling into the rabbit hole, is really, it's every time I see this in my house, I have this very sort of Alice feeling. And in The Passenger and Stella Maris, the main protagonist, the female, who's the protagonist in Stella Maris, is a woman whose name is Alice to begin with, and then she changes it to Alicia, I think, when she's 16. And that name is important. In my mind, it had a lot to do with Alice in Wonderland, and I think that that has to be the case. Alicia, in the book, I'm going to go by her chosen name, not the name that her father gave her. She is like such an Alice in Wonderland in the sense that she is really down a lot of rabbit holes. I mean, her whole entire life is like a physics and a math rabbit hole. So she gets obsessed with, I mean, she talks at one point about reading, 18 hours a day, and she's reading like philosophy and, mathematical theory and whatnot. And then also this idea of like, she's read 2 books a day for the past 15 years. So she's someone who's really down the rabbit hole. She's also someone who is seeing auditory and visual hallucinations. So you have this sense of kind of that otherworldly nature behind the looking glass, that she's very much inhabiting that. So in my mind, it was definitely a nod to Alice in Wonderland. And you mostly think her name is Alicia, and then once or twice her uncle and her grandmother refer to her as Alice. And so you have this sense of Alice as both being, in my mind, it had everything to do with this idea of Alice in Wonderland. But then she says at one point in Stella Maris that her father named her Alice and named Bobby Robert because Bob and Alice are typical names that are in like math problems. I have actually a different theory about Robert, which is, this is so interesting to me. In The Passenger and in Stella Maris, the father figure, we know his last name is Western, although he's also known to have been from Jewish descent. His parents are Jewish, and we know that, and he is Jewish, and their mother is also Jewish. So, and which is important because we're talking about work that they're doing on the atomic bomb. So this would have been during a time of real persecution and real trouble for Jewish people. So we have this idea of him as this last name Western. You have this idea that he's sort of hiding behind this idea of this last name Western, and he does not have a first name. So the father in the book never is named, which is so significant because he's also very absent from the book. He had died of cancer when they were young-ish, and he's sort of ever present in the book and also not present at all. And what that should make you think of a little bit here is the idea of God. You should be thinking of him as like our father, meaning like some sort of God, like, force. And, he gave both of them light, and he brought the atomic light to the world. He was a physicist who was working with Oppenheimer and all of the people at the Manhattan Project. So he's really like this idea of him as having the last name Western, which to me seems like a made up kind of a thing or an adopted kind of thing. But the fact that he's nameless is very, very important. And that he names his daughter Alice, and that he names his son Robert. Also, Robert to me, it speaks of Oppenheimer, and he would have named his son before he had met Oppenheimer. But I think there is meant to be some sort of resonance with Oppenheimer and his son Robert. Also, Alicia decides that she wants to change her name, and at this point her father has died in Mexico seeking a cancer cure. he died, when she was younger. But it is Alicia Alicia is like a Spanish version of it. It's Mexican in derivation. It's a Spanish version of of Alice. So you do have this idea too of Mexico as really a sort of this land that would have potentially cured their father, even though nobody was actually very hopeful about that. So in terms of structure, the passenger structure is so interesting. We have italicized chapters that alternate with ones in Roman type, and the italicized chapters are Alicia, whoops, they're Alicia, and she's, most of the time she's visiting with her, she calls them her horts, as in cohorts, and these are her auditory and visual hallucinations. So she was diagnosed as schizophrenic, although in Stella Maris you realize that diagnosis is a little, she seems very, very sane in Stella Maris, and she actually seems pretty darn sane in the passenger. Like you get the sense that she has these visions. She calls them chimeras, she calls them the entertainers, but you get this sense of her as actually being very rational and really very sort of coherent. She's also someone who is deeply frustrated in her love. Okay, I'm gonna just spoil it right now. No, I'm not gonna spoil it. I'm not. She's frustrated in love. Her love is unrequited and is impossible. And so that is very, very difficult for her. And she is sort of possessed by that. And she also, again, is like this incredibly, incredibly smart young woman, graduated from the University of Chicago by the time she was like 14 or something, and then was in their doctoral program. She graduated from high school, I think, when she was 12, went to college then. Like, it's just like an incredible prodigy, who makes the point, actually, that prodigy, the Latin it's the same word as monster. It's the same root as monster. So she's someone who is a very troubled person. Whether or not she's actually schizophrenic is for the reader, I think, to determine. So we have these italicized chapters that tell us about her experience. The book actually opens with her suicide. So we know that she's going to kill herself, which is such an interesting way to open the book, because you know where she's headed. And I think some people might have liked the idea of being able to sort of wonder what was going to happen to her. I think it's much smarter the way that he has done it, because it adds this tension just in terms of what her brother is going to do with this. So at the beginning of the book, we have her death, and then we also right away have her brother looking in this salvage. He's doing this deep sea salvage of a private jet that has gone down, and one of the passengers is missing. So the thing, the title of the book obviously is The Passenger, and a lot of the tension in the book, at least in sort of the first half of The Passenger, is the idea of who this passenger might be. But for anyone who is reading this as sort of like a thriller or a mystery, I think you will be frustrated and a little confused. I had a very good friend who read the book, and I asked if she liked it, and she's like, yeah, I really liked it, but I don't know that I got it, because I don't know what happened to the passenger. So she's like, could you please read it and get back to me? And I will get back to you. I'm getting back to you right now. And what I'm telling you is that the passenger is like the least important thing. I mean, essentially what we have here is another case, very much like No Country for Old Men, where Bobby Western has sort of seen too much. And very quickly, we have some people who are after him. They may be government agents. It's unclear why they are after him. It's also unclear who is after him. And you do get the sense that he has sort of seen something he shouldn't have seen, that they think he knows something that he shouldn't know. But you have this much larger question of, and this is really the theme that runs through both of the books, really this idea that their father, who was one of the creators of the atomic bomb, sort of unleashed this horror on the world, and that the sort of sins of the father are being visited on the children. So that with the unleashing and with all of the evil and with all of the death that came with the atomic bomb, that subsequent generations are sort of damned and doomed and cursed, because it was sort of like some sort of karmic retribution for the generation that had gone before Bobby and Alicia. So the other thing that structures The Passenger is that we have a lot of digressions. And later, I am going to do like a little party trick where I'm going to just open up to a random part of any one of these digressions. And I will argue, in fact, that these digressions are very enriching to the whole novel. But you definitely have this structure that some people, I think, found a little tedious. I think some people just kind of didn't get it. This idea that you have some of the chapters are about Alicia. Some of the chapters are Bobby Western evading the people who are after him. And then we have some flashbacks, but we have a lot of digressive conversations where he will sit down with his old friend or a very close friend of his who is a transgender woman in New Orleans, or with this private investigator who he is somewhat working with. So we have kind of a bookend with his best friend, John Shadan, I think is how they say it in the audiobook. So we have him early on, and then we have him much, much later. And W.C. Fields is so funny. W.C., like the composer, the transgender woman's name is W.C. Fields. And she also is I think a friend from a long, long time ago with Bobby. So Bobby has these very old friends who he trusts. And W.C. Fields has a very important role at the very end of the novel. So you have these scenes, and they are certainly digressive, and yet they're incredibly illustrative of the really important themes. It's almost like we have a reiteration of these really important questions that Bobby is trying to figure out, and he's using all of these different people and their areas of expertise in order to sort of figure out what is happening in his life and what he ought to be doing and what he is being surveilled for and how to feel about his family and all of these large, large issues. So with the structure of The Passenger is this sort of alternating views of Alicia and her brother. Stella Maris is shorter, and on some level it's much it's easier to read. I think you could certainly read The Passenger, and I think you could probably read either and not really miss the other. But I think that reading them together is so cool because Stella Maris really fills in actually a lot of the a lot of information that you don't have in The Passenger. I definitely think you should read The Passenger first and then Stella Maris, because I think there's some kind of spoilers in Stella Maris. Stella Maris is, the way that is structured is also unique. It is Alicia talking to her therapist right toward the end of her life. We have the alternating points of view in The Passenger, and then we have just dialogue of the two of them in the office, and the therapist is sort of trying to understand how he might be able to help Alicia. I think it's unlike McCarthy to have these kind of structures that are so conspicuous, but it's really, really effective, especially the Stella Maris part. I really loved it. Importantly, Stella Maris really puts Alicia really at front and center. And she is also very, very central in The Passenger. But Stella Maris, we have a lot of her voice, and we have a lot of her voice not just, hallucinating. We have her voice talking very lucidly with her doctor. And also we have a lot of digression in Stella Maris because it's a lot of conversation about mathematics and a lot of conversation about physics and about the nature of reality and religion and afterlife and these ginormous questions. But you feel very tethered as the reader. You have a good sense of sort of like what is going on, and it really helps fill in some of the gaps that you have after The Passenger. Gaps you didn't even really know you had. I mean, you kind of did, but then you're like, oh, that's what was going on in The Passenger. It's really very satisfying. My sense is that probably McCarthy, he's been working on these, purportedly for decades and decades. My sense is that probably they were meant to be all in one book, but I find this incredibly effective. I love them being separate volumes. I love that they each have a very distinct structure, and I love that the structures kind of, they have some similarities in terms of a male voice and a female voice. I just really think it's very well done, and it's very satisfying. Again, I listened to Stella Maris, and I really liked that. Oh, this is like I have a little digression here myself. Another reason I wanted to do a Fox Page lecture about McCarthy is that he is known as being like, I mean, talk about a dude novel. Like, this is just like about as dude novel as you can get. And I was very frustrated because, there's some critics, female critics, who write about his work, through sort of a feminist lens. They're mostly very critical of him. But when I was listening to different podcasts and doing my research on The Passenger, there were so many, frankly, like not great podcasts by all these men. And it was a lot of pontificating and a lot of men like making conjecture about things. And frankly, there was a lot of misinformation. Not like, well, actually, yeah, there was some really lame interpretation. And everyone is entitled to his opinion. I say his there on purpose because literally it was all men. This sounds weird that I'm putting so much kind of emphasis on like males and females and male critics and female critics, but I think I was very interested to know why it was just all these men. I finally found an interview by a woman, and it was a review of the audio version of the book. And the woman in it didn't even really say much. It was so disappointing. So I wanted to add my voice as a woman, and as a woman who is really deeply invested in the work of McCarthy and is really interested in reading it as a woman and as a feminist. I mean, it is a world that is definitively male, and we're going to get into why I think that is the case. But I mean, first and foremost, there are not that many women in this world. And these are worlds that are generally inhabited almost exclusively by men. The Western novels are like a bunch of men out, in the deserts of Mexico by themselves, or in Texas, or wherever they are. And a lot of the occupations that he seems very interested in, that McCarthy is interested in, tend to be occupations that are held by men. We have all the salvage divers, or we have, I think the guy in No Country for Old Men is like a welder or something. I think he really is. I think he loves his girlfriend or his wife, or my memory. My memory is not that great. But you have these very, very male worlds where, there's an enormous amount of violence. There's an enormous amount of sort of this fight between good and evil. I think I was particularly satisfied by these two books because at the end of his life, and, at the end of like this kind of indisputably great body of work, we have finally a woman come to the fore who I really am just very intrigued and impressed by. So before we move on to the actual prose, I want to just dive a little bit into these enormous themes. We're not going to dive in. In fact, we're going to skim over the top of them. I just wanted to sort of lay out some of the themes that I think, he's really deftly handling. So we have the nature of evil, which is something that he is deeply preoccupied with throughout all of his work. We have the nature of men and humans. What is it about men, and it's mostly men, that makes them do terrible things? And what is it, again, it's not far from the nature of evil, but sort of like, what does human evil look like? He has said that he can't imagine a world without bloodshed and thinks that would be naive. And he really does believe that violence is sort of really part and parcel with who humans are. We have this idea of the sins of the father revisiting the subsequent generations. Very clearly here we have this enormous preoccupation with the atomic bomb. And very much like Faulkner is dealing with the legacy of slavery, we have this very complicated legacy, just one generation removed, of one of the men who invented and who was not remorseful about the atomic bomb. So you have this really big question about sort of intergenerational, do we inherit, the evils? I mean, if you think they're evils, and neither of the kids think their father was evil, but they do think that, they have a complicated legacy given what that atomic bomb unleashed, and not just in terms of the death toll in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, but they're concerned about sort of the escalation of all of this. It's very much like Frankenstein, this idea of unleashing this whole new thing into the world, and not trusting men to be careful and protective and reasonable with this new technology. And of course, I will make the argument, it's really eerie to be reading this book in 2023 because, at one point, Alicia says something about how the last century is being the most destructive in the history of mankind. when we have continued, in fact, to be careless and to be short-sighted and to be selfish. And, when you think about climate change, it's all, you have these enormous sort of legacies of human destruction and the idea of extinction and the idea of moving towards something or setting something in motion that we cannot, in fact, stop. We also have themes that are sort of timeless and are very important, but aren't quite as large in scope. One is this idea of forbidden love. One is the idea of family loyalty. How much loyalty do these children have to their father and to their mother? There's also this real question of the possibility of union between two people. Like, is it possible for people to sort of actually come together? How much is each of us truly alone? There's a lot of people alone and feeling lonely, and people being isolated, and people feeling adrift in McCarthy in general. This idea of like how essentially alone is each of us is a very large question in this book. The idea of predestination, of organized religion, of an afterlife, of God. I mean, these are all themes that are just throughout the entire novel. We have this idea of scientific progress. I'm making, quotation mark fingers here, because again, we have this idea of not all progress as being good, and also of people being very irresponsible with, the resources that they have at hand. We have this question of punishment. Who deserves punishment? Who is making laws? Who is deciding what is okay and what is not okay, both in terms of social mores, but also in terms of like these much bigger kind of intergenerational ideas of punishment. Do the subsequent generations, in fact, owe some sort of karmic debt? We have an enormous focus on physics and math. And I want to say something about that. I literally still cannot do my times tables. Like, it's a bit of a joke in our family. Talk about a party trick. It's like, it's actually, I mean, it should be more embarrassing than it is. I'm actually not that embarrassed, but I was never ever good at math. And I wasn't that drawn into, I only did like high school science. I got a C+ in chemistry. I forgot to turn in my lab notebook. I mean, not a great look. I was busy. I was busy racing around, actually getting into quite a bit of trouble at that point in my life. But this is to say that I am not someone who knows. I cannot get physics. I cannot understand light. I cannot understand math. I mean, I am not a STEM person. I liked biology. I liked geometry, which like tells you everything you need to know. And I loved the science in this book. I loved the physics. I even just liked all the kind of name dropping of all these mathematicians, because I was like, oh my God, that guy sounds German. And oh my gosh, oh, I actually know that. I know who Feynman is, and I know who Alan Turing is. Even though I'm someone who like has no knowledge of mathematics, higher mathematics, or lower, frankly, and I have no knowledge of physics, like negative, I still really, really enjoyed these deep dives into both physics and math, because he's so good that, there's this real sort of obvious philosophical thing happening that you can see as part of the discussion. We have big questions about the nature of reality. The nature of sanity is a big one. So there are these huge themes that sound cumbersome, and they're really not. I mean, a lot of the book is very heady, but it's just absolutely just incredibly well done. It is now time to do my favorite part of the lecture, which is to talk about the gorgeous prose. And I want to move beyond the thing that everybody mentions, which is the kind of non-standard punctuation and the lack of glosses or attribution in dialogue. We always need to ask that question, so what? I mean, somebody in one of these interviews I listened to, it wasn't even an interview, it was like a silly, I was going to say stupid. It was a really silly reading of this book. But he was saying that he wanted the reason why McCarthy like lacked in punctuation and didn't put attributions and glosses and whatnot is because he wanted the reader to work harder. I just don't ever buy that argument. Nobody the reason shouldn't be like, oh, I want the reader to work harder. The reader might have to work harder, but there has to be a bigger, a more meaningful one than just like, I'm going to make someone work hard. So what I will say is that this lack of quotation marks, it is much more realistic in the sense that it's like you're closer to the dialogue. It's like there's an intimacy to it because you're just looking at the words. I also think it forces him to, the dialogue is so good and it's so forceful. And I think in part that's because he's not relying on any kind of adverbs in the glosses. It's not like she said dejectedly or, whatever kind of clumsy writing somebody would do. It's just very, very hardworking. And this idea of most of the writing, the punctuation, and a lot of the sentences as being very stripped down and very spare. I will argue that he's also totally decadent and florid. It's sort of, things are either kind of, it's a combination of both. Some very short declarative sentences that feel very much like Hemingway, and then these long, beautiful sort of Proustian things. He said he doesn't understand Proust or Henry James. And let me tell you, when Cormac McCarthy said he doesn't understand them, what he means is like he does not value them. He's just like not into this kind of navel-gazy kind of, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying that about Proust, because I love Proust. And I would argue, in fact, that Proust is looking at a lot of these same questions. But again, McCarthy it's a very different set of priorities that we are seeing in this book. So to talk about, the spareness and the idea of the writing being stripped down and then also kind of grandiose, is about this idea of people, his protagonists, these men, as being really, they're searching for self-awareness. They are somewhat self-aware, but there's this real drive in them to understand things better. And my thesis is that the writing is stripped down because they are generally quiet. They're generally unassuming. It actually generates an enormous amount of sympathy when these men they're pretty quiet. They're pretty laconic. They're like these just kind of still waters running very, very deep. And also the punctuation, I think he's just, again, like wanting things to be very plain and very spare, and then, also very grandiose. Okay, he does a lot of compound words. So, and that's a very James Joyce thing. So like, and it's not just like living room. It's like, I'm gonna have to come across one in the writing itself, but they're very unusual compound words. He's making them up. They're like grammatically, or in terms of syntax and spelling and grammar, they're not correct, but they're beautifully done. And there's always a nuance when you jam these words together and create a new word. There is a nuance that is really meaningful, and it's really, there's a kind of a very efficient thing that he is doing with these compound words. His gorgeous prose also has a lot of something called polysyndeton. So polysyndeton is just that instead of having commas, you have the word and. So when all these people are like, oh my God, his punctuation is so stripped down, I think part of the reason why he doesn't have as many commas and why it seems like the punctuation is stripped down is because there is a lot of this polysyndeton. So instead of saying, I went to the store to buy milk, bread, and cheese, it would be milk and bread and cheese. So actually, that sounds delightful to me right now. But that example, I think, does actually give you a sense of it slows the reader down. It makes you focus on all three of the words instead of just thinking of them as like a laundry list and like zipping through toward the end. You really think a little more about each one. It also places them all sort of on the same level instead of that kind of the natural thing for the psyche to do. Psyche? I don't know if it's your psyche, but your brain is, you're kind of moving along, and the last word tends to have a little more weight just because you're moving toward it and because you have that little gap between it and the next sentence, however small, to have your brain kind of dwell on it. But when you add the ands in, it sort of, everything is elevated a bit and everything is put on the same level. That's also a very Hemingway thing. You can kind of imagine Hemingway, the day was hot and dry and long, that kind of thing. So we have the polysyndeton. We have a lot of digression in the prose, which I really love. It's not even that he sets up something incredibly taut and like full of tension and then has a digression and comes back to it. It's simply that these digressions are so interesting and so well done and so beautiful that you're happy to just kind of spend a lot of time with them. He's so good at figurative language, and anyone who has watched the Fox page before knows that I'm very choosy. Don't throw figurative language in there if you're not good at it. Really, figurative language being metaphor and simile and personification and pathetic fallacy. Anytime the words on the page are meaning more than just what the words on the page are denoting. Every time it's incredibly apt, and there's a surprising amount of figurative language, and always the kind of so what is just astounding. He's just an absolute master. We also, another mark of this gorgeous prose is again sort of the vulnerability in these quiet, like really sensitive protagonists. But it's interesting too that the characters tend to be very competent and very sort of modest in their whatever they're doing. Bobby Western, for example, is very, very bright, very, very smart guy, was going to be, you know, like this big mathematician guy, very much like his sister, then became a race car driver and then a salvage diver, largely because he has like really a very strong wish to, I mean, this is like another thing that we have, the sort of death drive and actually the sex drive, all these kind of Freudian drives are very apparent in McCarthy in general. And certainly Bobby Western is doing things that are very dangerous, in part because he is miserable in his life, very much like his sister, both of them, for a very big reason, which I am not going to spoil for you. We also have really subtle but very potent humor. So the humor, Dwight Garner is a big fan of like the hilariousness of McCarthy, and I'm not sure it's hilarious, and it's certainly not the thing that people tend to lead with, but he is very funny, and we're gonna look at some things. And honestly, sometimes you just really need the comic relief. Like you just are like, oh my God, thank God this is even remotely funny, because I really need a break from all of this darkness. Although again, incredibly rewarding, really, really engaging work. Oh, and I mentioned before about the dialogue. I mean, the dialogue is absolutely masterful. You have these characters that pop into the passenger, and not so much Stella Maris because it's just the therapist and Alicia talking, but throughout the passenger, there are people who, the best example that's just popping right to my mind is that Bobby goes and visits someone who was in the like sanatorium with his sister, and it's just dialogue between the two of them with no glasses. We can't really see the guy very well in the scene, but the dialogue is such that you feel like you absolutely know who he is. Finally, we are going to look at 4 different, very short chunks of this work, because I really want to show you how incredible the prose is. And also, this will be a good way, I think, to take a look at some of these bigger themes by looking at these sort of microcosms of the novel. First on page 96. So this is when these glasses are so crazy. They're so magnifying. I just can't even, I'm getting dizzy. I'm like this one, I'm like Alice falling down the hole. This is when he has an apartment and he has a cat. So there's a lot of cats and a lot of birds throughout the novel. It's so skillfully done. I mean, the different birds themselves and the different instances when cats arrive. I mean, you could write a doctoral thesis on the birds in this. At one point, there are 2 moon-faced owls whose, oh wait, I think we might be reading that part. Hold your horses, hold your birds, hold your flock of birds on that, hold your murder of crows. We're here in the middle of 96. This is when he is realizing that these people who are surveilling him are in fact really threatening, and that he and his cat might need to move. I think in lots of cases, the cat is sort of a stand-in for Alicia. This is like as close as he can get to another human is this idea of this cat, which, you know, everybody knows how cats are. Cats are very like, take it or leave it. You know, he doesn't have a dog. It's not a dog traveling around with him. But we are here to look at the prose. He unplugged the table lamp and carried it to the door, and then began to take everything out to the truck and load it into the cab or wedge it in the front of the boom. 5 trips and he was done. So the truck is important. He becomes, in fact, very itinerant, becomes nomadic in lots of ways. But even this idea of, I don't even know what the boom is, in the cab or wedge it in front of the boom. So this is one of these very flattering things that Cormac McCarthy does. There are many, many terms of art in his work. And a term of art is simply like a word or a term that is used in a certain industry or a certain pursuit that is not known to lay people. I don't know what the boom of a truck is, but he doesn't explain it. We understand like it's a part of the truck and he's wedging stuff, you know, like around it or into it or whatever. So you have, you know, enough of what it is, but he's very flattering because he sort of assumes that you, the reader, are like as wide ranging in your interests and your authorities and your knowledge as he is. So it's this very cool thing. And, you know, anyone out there who's actually a writer, definitely don't over-explain. Trust your reader, because if the reader understands, they'll be like, oh, I totally know. I know what the boom of the truck is. And if they don't know, they'll be like, oh my God, wait, that's cool that he thinks I understand what the boom of the truck is. Also, what we're talking about here is 5 trips and he's done. It's the lamp. So we're looking for illumination. He's unplugging it. He's in the dark. Or, like at least metaphorically, he's in the dark. He has this idea of carrying, the lamp itself. Like he's needing to bring this illumination with him. He needs to understand not only, who's after him and what's happening in his life, but like these much bigger questions about how much he owes, some sort of debt for his father's invention of the atomic bomb. We also have this idea that 5 trips and he was done. He just doesn't have very much stuff. He has slowly kind of divested himself of everything, and he just has very few belongings. He's become, again, somewhat of a nomad. And then we have this. He knelt and crawled up under the bed, talking to the cat until he could reach it. Come on, Billy Ray. Nothing's forever. It wasn't the sort of news that a cat liked to hear. It's so good. I wrote in the marginalia, I wrote ha, that's like my little clue to myself that I need to look back if I'm looking for instances of humor. It's not like laugh out loud funny. It's not like hilarious, but it is this kind of subtle humor that gives you a break. So he says, nothing's forever. And then it wasn't the sort of news that a cat likes to hear. So the other thing that's happening here, of course, is that even instances of humor like this, where we have, this question about like, can anything be forever? Like it's a very, very large question that he is making light of here. Nothing's forever is very resonant. It's at the end of this paragraph. He's having to move. And he means that, his current living situation isn't forever. But also there is this idea of literally like, the annihilation of a whole entire city by an atomic bomb, or there is the idea of, change as always being the norm, or as, extinction or climate change, or there's like very, very large resonance, not to mention that, his childhood or his sister's childhood or his mother's life, she died of cancer early. Like, this idea of nothing being forever, he's just saying it to the cat, and yet it is hugely informative of the rest of the book. And the idea that it wasn't the sort of news that a cat likes to hear, we also know that, in fact, this is news that he doesn't want to hear. But what's happening that for me is really important here is that there's a certain amount of projection of his emotions and his needs onto this cat. So I'm not going to tell you what happens to the cat because I don't want to spoil things, but I will say that the cat is, in lots of ways, it's kind of an externalization of what he is feeling. So this idea of it's not the news the cat wants to hear, it's also not news that Bobby wants to hear. Billy Ray, I don't really know. I don't really know like it's probably not Billy Ray Cyrus that we're talking about here. I'm thinking of Ray, like a ray of light. I don't have a great response for why the cat's name is Billy Ray, but I can tell you that for sure there would be a real reason for that. There are lots of names actually in the book, but I can guarantee you, or I would bet you a lot of money, that in fact all of them are going to be significant just because McCarthy is that good. Okay, we're going to move on to another instance of why this prose is so amazing on page 133. So we find out later that their father, this is not spoiling anything, but their father dies in Mexico. They're landing in the airplane, he and his sister coming back from Mexico. This is the kind of pyrotechnic writing. It's not the stripped down, spare. This is a much more expansive kind of prose, and it's important to remember that this is also Bobby. It's definitely a third person narrator, but we have this sense of being very close to his consciousness. In the dying light, a river like frayed silver rope, lakes deep in the stone coulees white with ice, the western mountains burning. The portside navigation lights came on. The starboard lights were green, as on a ship. The pilot would turn them off in the clouds because of the reflection. When he woke her later, far to the north, a desert city was passing under the wing and sliding off into the darkness like a crab nebula. A cast of stones upon a jeweler's black cloth. Her hair was like gossamer. He wasn't sure what gossamer was. Her hair was like gossamer. I mean, this is so beautiful. It's so beautiful. It's also like a little bit funny. So I want to just pick this apart a little bit. So we have this kind of fragmentary language. It almost feels like there aren't verbs. And in the first one, there isn't a verb. And it's very descriptive in this. Again, we have this incredible figurative language, a simile in the beginning. In the dying light, a river like a frayed silver rope. Here we have this beautiful simile with light, and you can imagine, the way that would look on the ground. The western mountains burning. So again, you have this idea of apocalypse, you have the idea of the sun, you have the idea of losing the light, the idea of sunset. Then this whole thing, the portside navigation lights came on. The starboard lights were green as on a ship. So this is another one of those kinds of terms of art, like this idea of the port side navigation lights came on. I can't quite picture that. I mean, I know you can kind of imagine in a commercial flight, the lights out on the wing, but this idea that he knows, in fact, that when they fly into the clouds, the pilot will turn off the lights because of the glare against the clouds. You have this sense that he is not only like a scavenge diver and a race car driver, but he also is, in fact, has piloted things and is very knowledgeable about ships. And so you have this sense of him as, again, being like this very authoritative figure. And then this idea of the crab nebula, there's a town underneath them that looks like a crab nebula. So you have this idea of the two of them as being in the middle of the universe because they're in this airplane. And at first you're seeing things like, a silver frayed rope, which, I mean, she hangs herself. I am so sorry. Can you hear that dog? That is so rude. Hold on, there's a dog being so rude at the door. Come on. So this idea of them and the crab nebula, this idea of them being in the sky and the two of them alone in this dark space, like kind of hurtling through the cosmos, you do have this sense of them, these two protagonists in the novel as being very much, they're very close, but they're also really, they're alone. They're alone in the world. But the idea of the crab nebula, like that's a very specific thing. It's a very, I don't even know what it is. I mean, a nebula is like some sort of a star situation. I think it's like, I don't know, like a star dying, or it's a star, or I don't know what it is, but it's like a astrophysicist kind of thing that, an astrophysicist would know. So you have this incredible knowledge on his part that he knows what a crab nebula is. Again, we don't have to, we don't have to know that. We know-ish what a nebula is. There's also such a nice tie-in between the airplane and the port side and the ship and the crab and the lake and the water. So all of this stuff is it feels very cohesive because there's sort of a watery element to all of this. The ice and the fire are actually totally separate, but you have this idea of a lot of geography. You have this idea of a lot of maritime stuff. You have an idea of like lights guiding your way and keeping you safe, so that someone else could see you, but then the idea of lights going out. You have the idea of the stars and navigation, being able to find your way places. All of the writing is so incredibly impactful because he's so good. It's astonishing. And then those last three sentences, first of all, it is like poetry. It's like sort of heartrending because again, in the very beginning that she hangs herself. There's a description there of her hair and her eyes when she is found that are really haunting. So this idea here of returning to her hair as being gossamer, it is really impactful because we know, in fact, that she is going to hang herself and depart from him forever. So he says, her hair was like gossamer. He wasn't sure what gossamer was. Her hair was like gossamer. So you have this, I mean, it's almost like a cone, like that, like those kinds of riddles where there is no way to answer it. But he has this idea, I mean, gossamer, I feel like it's diaphanous, but also maybe gold. I feel like it's golden and also kind of, diaphanous. So you have this sense of this like poetic thing here and this impossibility that he doesn't know what it is, and yet he is sure that that's what it is. You also, at the end of this kind of fragmentary and very figurative paragraph, you have these very declarative sentences. Her hair was like gossamer. He wasn't sure what gossamer was. Her hair was like gossamer. You have repetition, you have declarative sentences, they're also similes, but you have like this kind of mixture of both very, this sort of fragmentary, really kind of florid writing, and then also writing that is very declarative and really just absolutely gorgeous. So this is a little passage on 360. It's just absolutely beautiful. This is later in the novel, so we have actually quite a bit more information. He is living in a barn at this point. He's again has sort of left. He's like on the lam here. And we have this beautiful description. He'd bought some school tablets and a small packet of ballpoint pens at the drugstore, and at night he'd sit propped against the hay bales and write letters to her by the light of the oil lamp. So one thing I will say about McCarthy is that there is a timelessness to his work. That is, I mean, this could be, you have a ballpoint pen, but other than that, once the ballpoint pen was invented, I don't know when that was, but like as soon as we had the ballpoint pen, this could have happened at any point. There is a sense of like both things being absolutely timeless, again, these very, very large questions of fate and of all of these huge, good and evil and destiny and religion, all of these large questions are, timeless. Part of the reason why his work feels so kind of classic and enduring and so relevant is because it does feel timeless in lots of ways. A lot of the border crossing, they're like out being cowboys, and it's very, I actually don't remember when it is. I feel like it might even be like in the middle of the 19th century. So you have this real sort of timelessness, which I think is excellent because it sort of helps us remember that these big, big questions are in fact timeless. Then he goes on and says, there were 2 owls in the barn gable even before the snow was gone. He stood in the bay and played the light up into the loft. 2 heart-shaped faces peered down, pale as apple halves in the light. They blinked and shifted their heads from side to side. Some wisps of straw fell. Okay, so this is incredible. I think you could read that and just be like, oh, whatever, like that's cool, there's some owls. But if you are like me, you're gonna really dig into this. Anytime the word apple comes up in any kind of literature, you need to think of the Garden of Eden. So we have this idea of owls in the barn gable. And in the beginning, we don't know that there are 2. But then he stood in the bay and played the light up into the loft. So he's shining a light on something. I mean, before we had the example with him carrying the lamp, I mean, I think we have this issue of light and dark, like, choosing the light or the evil, the good or the evil, the light or the dark. But you also have this idea of him needing to illuminate things. He needs to understand them. There's also the idea of darkness and oblivion, and there's a lot of stuff about light with the atomic bomb that is really very significant. Apparently, I also need to write a dissertation about the light in this book as well. But then we have this. 2 heart-shaped faces peered down. So this idea of heart-shaped faces, owls do have those big white heart-shaped faces, like the 2 halves of apples. And in fact, I learned not that long ago in a little falconry hour that those are actually ears. They have their eyes, but like those big kind of flat plates around their eyes are actually their ears, which is incredible. But we have these 2 heart-shaped faces. So it's very important that there are 2 of them. And it's very important that they're heart-shaped because a lot of this book is about the idea of unrequited love. And a lot of this book is about, the inability to be truly with another person. That it's about sort of the fundamental loneliness and the fact that people are fundamentally alone. So this idea of 2 heart-shaped faces peering down, it's reinforcing this idea that he's very much alone, but he's being observed by a pair of hearts, essentially. Then we move on a little bit. 2 heart-shaped faces peered down, pale as apple halves in the light. So we have this repetition of light, which is beautiful. We also have all of these plosives. So we have peered down, pale as apple halves, and then blinked. So we have these plosives, the P's and the B's. you have this sense of possibility here, and you have this sense of like a little more, not exactly levity, but like it's not like L's or S's sounds. There's a little more sort of liveliness here. We have the idea of these owls, and we have the idea of playing the light, and we have this idea of faces peering down, heart-shaped. We have all these P's. All of those plosive sounds are like the narration is speeding up a little bit because we have the surprise of these owls up above. And this idea of apple halves. So again, you need to, whenever you have an apple, you need to think of the Garden of Eden. And there's a lot of talk in here about Satan. And there's a lot of talk in here about Satan tempting Adam and Eve. So the sort of Edenic overtones in this book and in Stella Maris are legion, lots and lots of overtones. So this idea here of apple halves, presumably if the apple is halved, then, knowledge has been discovered, the fruit has been eaten. And when Adam and Eve eat, when they eat from the tree of knowledge, they are discovering that they are naked. They are discovering that they have committed original sin. They have discovered that they are flawed. They are being condemned. It's a fall from grace. And then we have here this, so we have that evocation of the fruit, the apple, and the two birds and the heart. So there's all of this overtones about love and sex and romance and like post-lapsarian, so like after the fall of Adam and Eve. And then we have some wisps of straw fell. So you have this idea of something falling. You have an idea of things sort of like an actual fall that is coming on the heels of this Edenic thing. It's just absolutely beautifully done. The last passage that I want to look at in this discussion of how gorgeous the prose is and how impactful and how just absolutely rich and dense and incredible the prose is on page 366. So here, this is actually the example that I mentioned earlier about the person who is in the sanatorium. He is a friend of Alicia's, and this is that incredible dialogue. I wanted to be sure we saw some dialogue. So his name is Jeffrey. And Jeffrey also seems pretty sane. I'm going to say that all of the people who are supposed to be so insane in this book actually seem very sane. I mean, again, one of the questions I think McCarthy is asking here is like the nature of sanity. Why are we so normative in terms of things needing to be in one certain way? Okay, on the top of 366. So this is when Bobby has come to the sanatorium where his sister was before she hung herself. And he's talking to this guy, Jeffrey, who is a friend of hers, and they are talking about her and what Jeffrey talked about with Alicia when she was in the institution with him. Jeffrey dug a small pair of binoculars out from somewhere in his robe and leaned and scanned the lawn. The world must be composed at least half of darkness, he said. We talked about that. Do you miss her? What, are you nuts? What do you see over there? Some green polka dot lizards, quite a few in the woods over there, big fuckers. Really? Maybe not like you, of course, but I sure do miss her. Who wouldn't? I thought she'd be safe here. She wasn't. She should have told me. I'd have gone with her. Would you really? In a heartbeat. It's a little bit cumbersome to be reading it out loud and to be hearing it on your part, but it's so impressive and it is so good. So this idea of him pulling out the binoculars, again, there's a lot of stuff about vision. There's a lot of stuff about being able to see things. There's a lot of stuff about lenses and glass and, physics, the physics of sort of vision and distortion. So, and again, he's pulling it out of his robe. So you have this idea that we're being reminded of the fact that he is, in a mental hospital. And then, of course, the thing that he remembers talking to her about, which he's just kind of feathering into the conversation here, is that the world is half dark. So that presumes that half of it is light, but half of the world as being dark is very dark. But what I love here is this part of the dialogue where Bobby says, do you miss her? And he says, what, are you nuts? And it's so excellent. And actually, it's what, comma, are you nuts? There's a comma for all of those people who say that Cormac McCarthy has no punctuation. Cormac McCarthy did say that semicolons are like literally should be outlawed, which that's like my second favorite punctuation mark. The first favorite, of course, being the M dash. Second, really, I mean, it's not actually the semicolon, but the semicolon's right up there. Probably a parentheses. I don't know. But this idea of what, are you nuts? is so it's so good. It tells us everything about Jeffrey. It tells us everything about how he is with other people. It tells us how he feels about Alicia. It's so deft, and it's working so hard, and it's so tidy and efficient. And then we have our Bobby changing the subject here. What do you see over there? And then this idea of some green polka dot lizards. Of course, we have him, Jeffrey, is poking fun at the idea of, like, of course, he's quote unquote crazy, so he's going to be seeing, you know, these polka dot lizards, these big fuckers. So you have this idea of him as being sane enough to know that the expectation on the part of Bobby is that he's seeing some crazy thing, when in fact, you know, there are a lot of people in the book, like Klein, who's the PI that he sort of hires at one point, who actually sound much less sane than this guy, Jeffrey. So we have this idea of these big fuckers, the green polka dot lizards. And then our Bobby says, really? And then we have Jeffrey say, maybe not like you, of course, but sure, I miss her. So you have this idea of the conversation is woven in, this question about whether or not he misses her. We think as the reader that we have moved on from that topic, but then very deftly Jeffrey comes back to it in a way that's a little jarring for the reader. It's a little bit like a misplaced modifier, but then it's so natural and it so catches you off guard in exactly the way that the conversation would. So it's just beautiful. And then this idea of when he talks about his devotion, when Jeffrey says that he thought she would be safe there, Stella Maris is when she goes, it's, you know, the entire book is her at the hospital. So you do have this sense of, and she, you know, the doctor's asking why she's there, and there is this sense of her wanting to be safe there. So it's absolutely tragic that we know that in fact she's not safe there, and that Jeffrey thought that she was, and it's so heartfelt and so sad. And in lots of ways, someone like Jeffrey, who we see only briefly, and yet we really have a good sense of them, in part because of the excellent dialogue. But you also have a character like Jeffrey articulating some of the thoughts and some of the emotions and feelings that Bobby himself is not able to articulate. So it's this beautifully efficient and incredibly hardworking dialogue that we see actually all throughout the book. I do want to touch briefly on this idea of misogyny in Cormac McCarthy. So it is true, and I find this as well, that the worlds that he is creating are these kind of hyper masculine worlds. So part of that's just because we just don't have very many women in these books. The protagonists tend to be men, with the exception of Alicia, but we have these protagonists, even though they're in these hyper masculine spaces. The protagonists themselves often, to me, seem like they are critical of the hyper masculinity around them. I mean, they're definitely, Bobby Western is a good example. He's a race car driver and a salvage diver, and like he's doing all of these crazy sort of hyper masculine things. I mean, I'm uncomfortable even saying this kind of thing, but I think it's fairly safe to say that being a salvage diver and being a race car driver, and frankly, even a mathematician, this is a very male world that he is inhabiting. In fact, his sister also inhabits the male world. She's the only woman at this math kind of place that she goes and tries to work through these problems with these mathematicians. And she's 17 and she's the only woman. So you have Alicia as this, very strong female figure in these hyper masculine settings. But even when you don't have a competent, well, I mean, I say she's competent because she's incredibly bright, and we have this very strong presence of this female person in these books, but really it's the men who dominate almost all the rest. When we do have female characters, they tend to be like in All the Pretty Horses. We have the older woman, Alfonsa. So she's kind of this matriarchal figure and basically says, you can do anything here on the ranch except have sex with Alejandra. So then, of course, he falls in love with Alejandra. But you also have this sense of Alejandra as being, a woman who is in this kind of hyper masculine male Mexican family, and Alejandra is used very much as a pawn, and they want to sort of marry her in these certain ways to other people for power plays. So you have kind of this criticism of these very patriarchal, very hyper masculine worlds where these men are operating. So, I mean, I hate to like be critical of other people's podcasts, but there was this whole thing about how all of the men in Cormac McCarthy are all these like they're all subject to this like damsels in distress thing, and that all of them like basically are kind of lured in by these women who need help, and that always kind of spells disaster for them. So, and this person in the podcast even said that like McCarthy had to sort of leave the three marriages in order to like pursue his art. I would argue it very differently. I would say that there are sensitive male protagonists who are, you know, operating in a world where they are very sensitive and can be very vulnerable in lots of ways. Certainly, Bobby Western is very vulnerable and he's very sensitive, and he is operating in this very hyper masculine world. He operates well in that world, and yet he's deeply uncomfortable. And what he is striving for is union with a woman, love and like union with another, with a woman, promises some kind of like deliverance and some kind of savior from this hyper masculine world, and yet it is not something that he can attain. So I would say that women, Alejandra also, women in these books are examples, I think, of this notion that people are fundamentally alone, and that essentially like the sort of romantic love and the idea of like having a soulmate, or the idea of like completing yourself. I mean, you can tell I'm a little skeptical of those ideas, but I think one of the things McCarthy is doing with the females in his books is this idea of men as being somewhat devoted to the idea, but the reality of you know, uniting with someone else and having it be you know, blissful and joyful and harmonious is simply not possible. I think in No Country for Old Men, I think the guy who's the welder is very devoted to his like wife or girlfriend or whatever. My sense is that women play somewhat minor parts, and yet they're very important in terms of representing the fact that you know, union is not in fact possible. It's a very curious thing. The Mother in the Road, one of the literary criticism, one of the feminist critiques was essentially that when you in The Road, the mother very early on realizes that the apocalypse is happened, and realizes how horrible things are, and essentially kills herself. So you also have, you know, we have Alicia in the very beginning of The Passenger having killed herself. So on some level, the theorist said that all of the women in McCarthy are either dead or dying, or I can't remember what the other thing, oh, absent, dead or dying. And it's true, it is true. But I think in both of the case of The Road, and also in the case with Alicia in Stella Maris and in The Passenger, the reader and all of the characters are deeply sympathetic with this urge to commit suicide. I mean, there is this deep sort of sympathy for this idea that like it's a very comforting thought that if you are in so much pain and you are so uncomfortable in your life here on earth, that you don't have to be in pain. So I think actually the mom in The Road, like I think a lot of people would have been like, okay, that was the right thing to do. That was the right move. I do think that it's too easy and sort of too like knee-jerky to dismiss these women as simply being absent. I also think one of the critiques of The Road is that then the father gets like all of these accolades for doing all of this maternal stuff, and that it's this kind of mother blaming, that the mother in killing herself, she like is, you know, abandoning her child, and that then the father has to sort of, you know, step up in this way that's like the mother's fault. But I would perhaps look at this in kind of what I call like the Disney phenomenon, which is that you have to get the mother out of the picture in order to have adventure ensue. And I mean, it's hard to think of The Road as just being an adventure story, but in lots of ways it really is. It's like the ultimate survival and adventure story. But if the mom were in the picture, it's like it would be too comfortable. There would be too much kind of comfort and solace and too much love, really. So also, just structurally speaking, it wouldn't be as great if you had a couple and their child roaming around. So you have this idea that like true, like in order for things to really become difficult, and in order to have a very difficult situation, you need to eliminate the mother, like in Dumbo and in Bambi and all of these, I mean, practically all of the fairy tales, you know, the mom's gone, you've got the stepmother. So in The Road, And actually in The Passenger as well, the mom she dies when the kids are 12, I think. So yes, 12. So the mother has to be out of the picture in order for in order for people to have to grapple with really, really difficult questions. So that would be my kind of rebuttal to this idea that that McCarthy is just like killing off all of the women and has no respect for them. Also, I will say that never would I read McCarthy. I mean, we read different people for different reasons. I would never read McCarthy like for a feminist take on something. I would never read it for like gender parity. I'm really happy and really interested in the fact that a woman is so central, certainly to Stella Maris, and that we have so much of her voice in that book. And, theoretically, we have half of The Passenger is also devoted to Alicia's voice, because we have these italicized chapters. A lot of it has to do with her hallucinations, but you can argue that all of those hallucinations are elements of her psyche that are simply embodied around her. So we have this real deep dive into this very, very compelling character named Alicia, who really seems to know herself and in lots of ways seems very sane. So I love that McCarthy is kind of ending with someone and with a woman at sort of at the center of things. And I wonder if that will also help some of the feminist scholarship of the McCarthy body of work as a whole. Before we end, I want to do the little parlor trick that I was alluding to before, which is simply that I want to take 3 of the digressions and I'm going to just pick a paragraph. I'm going to pick a number and I'm going to go to that place, and we're going to see if my theory holds true that each of these digressions is in fact incredibly valuable. Okay, so the first one is the W.C. Fields. So this is this old friend of his. I think they grew up together, maybe even in Knoxville. People say that this book is autobiographical in part because a lot of it takes place. Cormac McCarthy really liked New Orleans. He spent some time in Ibiza. So people are like, oh, this is very autobiographical. I beg to differ. I mean, maybe a little bit, but simply because the protagonist of the book spends time in the same places does not mean this book is autobiographical. Okay, so between 71 and 81, those pages is the W.C. Fields chunk. It's one of the digressions, there's several, and it's beautiful the way these digressions kind of repeat and echo. But I'm gonna pick the number 74. I love the number 4. I'm going to page 74 here, and I'm going to go down to the first, it's going to be the first big, the first big chunk here. The waiter came and placed the silver. Another came with bread wrapped in a cloth napkin. When their waiter came back, Western ordered for both of them. The waiter nodded and moved away. She took a long draw on the cigarillo and moved her head in a slow upward arc, exhaling. He couldn't even imagine what her life was like. So, oh my gosh, done it. So this is so beautiful. So W.C. Fields, at the very end of the book, Bobby entrusts her to read the letters from Alicia that Bobby would never had been able to bring himself to read. So there are a couple of letters that he's been carrying around, and at one point someone says, oh, you probably don't want to read them because you don't want the story to be over. And in fact, I think as the reader, you sort of intuited that. At the end, he gives the reader, gives the letters to W.C. Fields to read and to sort of digest for him. And it's this very intimate, incredibly wrenching and really, really difficult and beautiful, beautiful passage where W.C. Fields has to absorb this energy. And it's really beautiful because the mystery of what is in those letters remains. I mean, as the reader, you don't really know what's in the letters, and Bobby himself doesn't have to know. Like, there is some mystery and there is some sort of sense that the story of his sister is not completely over. But again, it's very difficult for W.C. Fields, and she is sobbing and sobbing because she's absorbing all of this pain. So what I am going to argue is that this woman so this is a transgender woman who is talking about wanting enough money to have her operation. So we know, in fact, that this is someone who is waiting for sex confirmation, gender confirmation surgery. So we know that this person is a female and definitely is passing as a female everywhere and is getting a lot of attention for being a very, very beautiful woman. just as Alicia is, but also we know that this person is in fact this trans gender woman still has male genitalia. So what I would argue is that this W.C. Fields, who is someone who has known Bobby for a long time here, is kind of an amalgam of the two of them. It's sort of like it's the idea of a union between these siblings. You have the sort of two halves in W.C. Fields. The other thing about W.C. Fields, this last sentence here, he couldn't even imagine what her life was like. If we are viewing her as kind of a stand-in for the sister and like a mouthpiece for the sister, because W.C. Fields is going to, she's going to like listen and she's going to hear the voice of Alicia and is going to digest that information and give some of the information to Bobby. So if we see her as a stand-in for Alicia, then this sentence, he had no idea what her life was like, is so poignant and it's so painful because you have this sense that he has no idea what his sister's life is like. It's just absolutely beautiful prose. This is the thing. When people are like, oh, these digressions are just going nowhere and it's such a weird structure and, it feels very kind of, fragmented and not cohesive, I beg to differ. That was totally random. We pulled out a paragraph that is really, I think, a very good argument for why, in fact, this woman is really a very important person. There's also, again, this unrequited love that is all throughout the novel and is a huge, huge driver of a bunch of the plot. Also applies to W.C. Fields because you have this idea of, not having had the gender confirmation surgery. So there's this idea of sort of unrequited, sexual energy here that we see her as a stand-in for. We also, this is someone who Bobby is incredibly, incredibly close to. And so you have this idea also of as Bobby as, a Southerner, but who's incredibly devoted and loyal to friends, and also is completely not fazed at all by the fact that one of his childhood friends has gone through a transition. And, Bobby is it's like literally his only friend. Well, it's one of his two friends in the world who we see in the novel who he's really close with. He has a handful. He has a handful of friends. In fact, we're going to look at the next one. Shadan is this next person, and he is also a childhood friend. We're going to look. The pages are from 150 to 162. Let's do 164 again. 4 is my favorite number, and also then that I'm not like rigging it. We're going to do 164 because that's an option. So we are now at the top of page 164, just like I said that we would. And this is a digression with his friend Shadan. I'm also noticing here, when you look at Shadan, I would have said Shedden. One quick aside, a digression within the digression, is that I saw a lot of Shreve from the Faulkner novel, The Sound and the Fury. Wow, it really took me a second to pull up that title. So Shreve is the best friend of Quentin Compson, and he's sort of a foil in many ways for Quentin Compson as Quentin is getting closer and closer to committing suicide himself. Quentin, who is in love with his sister in that novel, and who is also really dealing with the legacy of something terrible, in this case, slavery, as opposed to the legacy of the atom bomb. So we have Shedden, who is very much like Shreve, but also Shadan. It's helpful that we have this Shadan character because he's asking a lot of questions because he knew he's known Bobby for a long time, but he's trying to get like the chronology straight, which is very helpful for us. So he's talking about when Bobby's father, who is again nameless, which is very important, when Bobby's father is like who he was working under and what his involvement was with the atomic bomb. He asks him about this mathematician and physicist Chu, and did he follow Chu? Bobby says, yes, then Berkeley. You said that he was the Pied Piper that your father followed into oblivion? Do I have that right? So you have this idea here. I mean, again, we've got this reference to the Pied Piper. We've got this reference to free will. We've got this reference to a literary figure in this case, and also like a child's kind of fable. But this idea, I mean, again, this idea of being led into oblivion. So that's a fragment into oblivion. It's so significant because, again, we're associating this father, this nameless father, who is this real mystery at the center of this book. The fact that the best friend is having to like kind of piece together who this father figure was, and that's kind of at the origin of the story. But we have this idea here of trying to map this whole thing out and still not having a very clear picture of him. And then, of course, the idea of oblivion is speaking to blowing something to oblivion, and this idea of this very nihilistic, very apocalyptic kind of preoccupation that McCarthy has, that we see in The Road, and we see it here again with the atomic age. We see it with this idea of what, you know, the atomic bomb is sort of leading us toward, and certainly with climate change. So you have this friend who's asking these questions about the family, and yet it's reinforcing the idea that the father is sort of, that what he wrought, you know, what he developed is really something very, very destructive. In fact, something that could turn them all into oblivion. There's also a lot of questions that Alicia is asking, essentially about, you know, the origin of all humankind, in a way that's like very heady, and also is this kind of these questions of oblivion, like what came before the Big Bang, and what is knowable and what's unknowable, and what is oblivion, and can there be such a thing as nothing? Because in order for something to be nothing, there has to be something that it is nothing in contrast to, if that makes sense. The last sort of digression that I want to look at is it's with Klein. And Klein, you know, that is a Jewish name. The Judaism comes more to the fore in Stella Maris, but it's very interesting. Again, I might have to write another dissertation here. This idea of the specifically of the fact that this is a Jewish family is, I think, significant, and we would have to look at that more closely. I have not, in fact, looked deeply at that. So, but this is the private investigator who, it's not clear, Bobby Western has no money, like a little into the book. Some points he does, some points he doesn't. So he can't really hire this guy, but this guy seems very interested in him and in his story. So they meet a few times. Again, we have this kind of nice woven thing with them meeting. And we have Klein as one of these things that could be seen as kind of like a digression that doesn't really add much, because he's not really doing a lot of private investigating work. And yet I would argue that in fact, the work that he's doing is very important, the digression that he is serving. So it's pages 243 to 253 is what we're looking at. We'll just look at 244, just because we're going to stick with the fours. Okay, my theory is totally holding. My theory being that I could turn to any one of these pages in these digressions, and that we would have something that was incredibly useful, either as kind of reiteration of important stuff, or you know, a very sort of meaningful piece of a novel. I mean, sure, you could take some of this stuff out and maybe the reader wouldn't know that it had been removed, but I would argue that all of it is additive. This is on 244. This is when he is very first meeting with Klein, and this is actually a very instructive passage, and it's dialogue, which is fun. I should ask what you charge. I get $40 an hour, including phone conversations. Are we on the clock? Not yet. I need to know what you're up to. Do you get a certain number of nutcases? Yes. Are you one? I don't think so. What do you do with them, the nutcases? I just string them along and take their money. You're kidding. Yes. You said on the phone that you don't do divorces. What else don't you do? Klein swiveled his chair slightly and swiveled back. This is going to be something weird, isn't it? Isn't that where we're headed? I don't know. Why don't you just lay it out with whatever economy you can muster? Okay. Western started with the airplane and he finished with the oil rig and with the two men in shirt sleeves at 7 Seas. Klein sat with his fingertips pressed each to each. He was a close listener. When Western finished, they sat. This is so good. This is so incredibly well done. I mean, this guy Klein is kind of just as weird as everybody else. Very significant here that we have Bobby asking whether or not he gets a lot of nut cases. So this question of who is sane and who is insane is all throughout the book. And this idea of sort of testing what Klein thinks about sort of nutcases is really important. It's also interesting that he's sort of so dismissive of it. I mean, you know, presumably his sister at least has been diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, but he's talking about like whether or not you get these nutcases. There's a certain amount of kind of acceptance and also dismissal of sort of the general idea of sanity here. And then Klein doesn't even answer seriously. Like he makes sort of a joke about it. So you have this sense of sanity and insanity as being just really not that important. That's one of the things that is being very artfully reinforced here. And then we have this idea, you said on the phone you don't do divorces. So we have this idea here of again, this is not someone who's going to divide people. And you have this reinforcement of the idea of a union, like a true union of two people, two beings, as impossible. I mean, divorce is the thing that's being mentioned here, and like sort of the possibility of it. So you have this idea that divorce is more kind of like a possibility, because in fact people are really not able to meld together. Then we go on, and he swiveled his chair slightly and swiveled it back. So this is like a gloss. We talked about this before, and it does help us know like sort of the order of the conversation. But this idea of turning away and turning back is also symbolic of this idea that sort of no one is a full ally, no one can be trusted, everybody's sort of on their own track. This idea of people moving away and moving back, this idea of being sort of alone and being tentative, and support as not being solid. You know, everything is kind of moving around. And then this is going to be something weird, isn't it? And so then the answer to that is, I don't know. So you have this sense like it's true. And as the reader, I mean, we are on page 245. We're like, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through the book. And as the reader, you still don't know. Like you still are like, wait, why are these people following him? It's so nebulous and it's so unresolved. And so we have a reinforcement of that here. And then we go on, and it's so great because McCarthy offers us one of the few kind of recaps. So he starts with the jet, then he talks about the oil rig, which he was working on an oil rig, and there was some surveillance that was happening there that was very suspicious. So we have this kind of recap of what has happened so far. But again, here we're 2/3 of the way through, and there's still this sense of like, nobody knows. He doesn't know. He doesn't even know. Like Bobby doesn't even know what he's coming to complain about or to like investigate, because the big questions in this book are so sort of not investigatable, if that's even a word. So it's very, this is a digression, yes, but it's very telling, and it's really interesting the way that it is reinforcing all of the, all of the different themes that are woven so carefully, and that are sort of both, iterated and then reiterated again and again in all of these different ways by all of these different personages. So skillful, so skillful. That's it. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope this has been interesting. I have really, really enjoyed this dive into Cormac McCarthy. It had actually been a while since I'd read any of his work, and it was such a treat to really dive into The Passenger and Stella Maris with the idea of being able to just really dig in not only to these works, but to try to think about why it is that his prose is so compelling to me. I really believe that this idea that he's one of our greatest American novelists is absolutely the case. And I think we'll return to this text in other circumstances. It's really an incredible literary achievement. And I hope that these different sort of advantages, and I hope that having gotten a slightly better sense of why I think the prose works so well, and a little better context for, how we can think about the prose, and how we can think about the structure, and think about the digressions, and how we can consider this book, these two books together as really the literary feat that they are. I hope all of that has been helpful and interesting. And I hope that you have enjoyed the talk as much as I have. Head on back to the Fox page, find yourself something else to listen to, and happy reading.